I stared at the message, feeling the anger crawl up my spine. I told them they wouldn't have had to miss it if they had just visited me before the event. They didn't argue, they just dismissed me entirely. It wouldn't have made a difference, they said. Why waste time coming to see you when your brother was making the family proud? I read that sentence over and over, my chest tightening with something I couldn't name. That was it. That was all I had ever been to them, an afterthought. I wish I could say it surprised me that this was some grand betrayal, but deep down I had always known. This was just the first time I let myself accept it. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because for the first time in my life, I realized it didn't matter. I was nothing to them. And maybe it was time to stop pretending that I ever would be. The hours stretched endlessly in that hospital room, a silent reminder of the things I had forced myself to overlook for years. It wasn't just the physical pain that weighed on me, though the dull, persistent ache in my ribs and the sharp, throbbing discomfort in my leg were enough to remind me of everything I had endured. It was something deeper, something that had settled into my chest like a wound that refused to heal. A quiet but undeniable understanding that I had always been an afterthought in my own family. I tried not to dwell on it too much, but the thoughts came unbidden, weaving themselves into every quiet moment, every long night where sleep refused to come. I had always known, on some level, that my parents saw my brother as their pride and joy, the one they boasted about at family gatherings, the one whose accomplishments were treated as family milestones. I had accepted it, or at least I had thought I had, convincing myself that it wasn't a big deal, that I had built my own life, one that didn't require their validation. But lying there, with no one but the occasional nurse checking in on me, I realized how much I had been lying to myself. I had wanted them to care, I had expected them to at least pretend, and that was my mistake. On the seventh day, after I had finally given up hope of hearing from them, my parents arrived. I had been staring at the window, watching the golden light of the late afternoon sun stretch across the sterile white walls, lost in thought, when I heard the door creak open. I turned, expecting a nurse, but instead, I saw them standing there, wearing expressions that were so carefully constructed, so deliberately arranged, that it was immediately clear they hadn't come out of concern. They had come for something. My mother was holding a bouquet of flowers, a bright, cheery arrangement that felt almost insulting in its forced cheerfulness. My father stood beside her, his usual air of quiet authority intact, his face unreadable as he stepped inside. They smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't quite reach their eyes, the kind you offer when you're trying to smooth over an uncomfortable situation without actually acknowledging it. I didn't bother pretending. I didn't smile. I didn't greet them with the warmth they hadn't earned. Instead, I just watched as they sat down, my mother placing the flowers on the small table beside my bed with a softness that felt almost performative. They asked how I was feeling, but the words were hollow, empty, as if they were checking off a box on a list rather than actually caring about the answer. I told them I was managing, my voice steady, betraying none of the bitterness I felt pressing against my ribs, right alongside the bruises and fractures. And then, without preamble, without hesitation, they got to the reason they had really come. My brother had been arrested. The words hit me like a slow-moving car, the kind you see coming but don't fully process until the impact has already knocked the breath from your lungs. My mother's voice cracked as she explained, her fingers twisting together in her lap, while my father sat rigid, his jaw clenched in something that could have been anger or shame, or just the sheer discomfort of having to ask something of me. He had been caught up in a fraud scheme, they said, something to do with falsified accounts, misappropriated funds, an entire investigation that had unfolded so quickly and so publicly that there was no hiding from it. He had been arrested for wire fraud, forgery, and embezzlement, and the company had turned everything over to the authorities without hesitation. There was no sweeping this under the rug. There was no quiet fix. And now they needed me. They had already spent a large portion of their savings on lawyers, trying to salvage whatever was left of his reputation, trying to minimize the damage, but it wasn't enough. They didn't have enough to pay for his bail, and so they had come to me, the daughter they had ignored, dismissed, and abandoned in a hospital bed, to clean up the mess their golden child had made. I should have seen it coming. Even as they sat there, trying to make their case, explaining in careful, measured words how this was about family, how this was my chance to step up and prove that I cared, I could hear the unspoken truth beneath their pleas. They hadn't come to make amends. They hadn't come because they felt guilty for what they had done, for the way they had treated me. They had come because they saw me as a resource, something to be used when their real child, the one they had always cherished, needed saving. It was almost laughable. They had left me alone in a hospital bed for a full week without so much as a phone call, had ignored every message I sent, had chosen an award ceremony over checking if I was even alive, and now they had the audacity to ask me for money. I could feel the bitterness rising, pressing against my ribs like a second injury, sharper than the fractures, deeper than the bruises. And yet, despite everything, despite the sheer absurdity of the situation, there was a part of me that still hesitated, still felt the old familiar pull of obligation. Because that was the worst part about family, the way it could break you down and still make you feel like you owed something. For a moment, I imagined what it would feel like to give in, to say yes, to hand over the money and play the role they had always expected me to play. But then I thought about that first night in the hospital, about the cold silence of my phone, about the way they had dismissed me like I was nothing more than an afterthought. And suddenly, the hesitation was gone. I told them no, and for the first time in my life, I didn't explain myself. I didn't try to soften the words, didn't offer excuses or justifications. I just let the silence stretch between us, let them sit there and feel the weight of my refusal the way I'd spent years feeling the weight of their indifference. They didn't take it well. My mother's face crumpled first, her carefully constructed mask slipping as she let out a small, wounded sound, something between a gasp and a sob, as if my refusal had genuinely hurt her. My father, ever the composed one, merely exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening as he muttered something under his breath that I didn't quite catch. They tried again, of course. They called me selfish, told me that family should always come first, that I was being cruel, vindictive, ungrateful, that this wasn't about my brother. It was about all of us, about keeping the family together. But I saw the truth now, clearer than I ever had before. This wasn't about family. It was about them losing control, about them scrambling to fix the cracks in the perfect image they had spent years constructing. It was about saving my brother, because he was worth saving, while I had always been nothing more than a background character in their carefully curated narrative. I didn't argue. I didn't try to change their minds. I just told them no. And when they realized I meant it, when they understood that for the first time in my life I wasn't going to bend to their will, they stood up, turned away, and walked out of that hospital room without another word. And somehow, despite everything, despite the years of hoping and waiting and wanting to matter, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The silence that followed my parents' departure lingered in the hospital room long after they were gone. I stared at the door for a moment, half expecting them to return, to make one last attempt at convincing me, but they didn't. It was strange, really, the way something could be both deeply familiar and completely foreign all at once. I had spent my entire life being overlooked, treated like an afterthought, dismissed in favor of my brother's endless string of achievements. But this time, I wasn't being ignored. I was being rejected for standing my ground, for daring to put myself first. And despite everything, despite the sharp sting of realization, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. For the first time, I had said no, and I had meant it. There had been no frantic backtracking, no desperate attempt to soften the edges of my refusal. Just no, and it had been enough to make them leave. But of course it wasn't over. I was discharged from the hospital 3 days later, still weak, still sore, still adjusting to the new reality of moving around with crutches. Every step was a reminder of the accident, of the weight of the impact, of the fact that I had survived something that could have easily ended me. I should have been focused on healing, on rebuilding, but my parents had never been the type to let things go so easily. The moment I pulled up to my apartment building, exhaustion settling into my bones, I saw them. They were waiting for me. It took me a second to process it, to take in my mother's tense expression, the way my father stood with his arms crossed, his jaw tight, his whole posture radiating barely contained frustration. They had planned this. They had found out my discharge date, waited outside my door like I was a cornered animal, ready to deliver whatever speech they had been rehearsing since I had turned them down in the hospital. I sighed, tightening my grip on my crutches, forcing myself to push down the immediate wave of exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. They didn't even wait for me to unlock my door before they started. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't a plea. It was an attack. They had let me off easy before, they said. They had given me a chance to prove that I was still part of this family, that I wasn't just bitter and resentful and vindictive. But now I had gone too far. They spoke over each other, their words crashing into me like waves, each one sharper than the last. My brother's situation was worse than they had initially thought. His charges were piling up, and the company had found more evidence, more damning proof of his involvement in the fraud scheme. He wasn't just facing a slap on the wrist or a fine, he was looking at years in prison. And somehow in their minds this was my fault. I was being spiteful, they said. I was holding a grudge over something that didn't matter anymore, using my hospital stay as an excuse to turn my back on them when they needed me the most. They accused me of being cruel, of wanting to watch my brother suffer. of deliberately choosing to make things harder for the family instead of just doing the right thing. I stood there, gripping my crutches, forcing myself to breathe through the anger, through the sheer, overwhelming audacity of it all. I had spent years bending over backward to make them happy, to earn even a fraction of the attention, the pride, the love they had so freely given my brother. I had spent years swallowing my disappointment, pushing down the resentment, telling myself that maybe, just maybe, one day I would be enough. And yet the first time I chose myself, the first time I said no, they had decided I was the villain. I told them as calmly as I could that I wasn't responsible for my brother's choices. That was when my mother's voice broke, her pain twisting into something desperate as she said the words that would stay with me for the rest of my life. "We've already lost one child," she said, tears spilling down her face, "and now we're going to lose two." The words hit me harder than the accident had. I felt the air leave my lungs, my body suddenly too heavy, my crutches digging into my palms as I tried to process what she had just said. She wasn't talking about death. She was talking about me. In her mind, in my father's mind, I was already gone. Because I refused to be their safety net, because I wouldn't sacrifice myself the way I always had, they had decided to erase me completely. I felt nothing. No sadness, no heartbreak. Just clarity. I told them, still calm, still steady, that if that was how they felt, then it was their choice, not mine. And then I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me without looking back. Even as they pounded on the door, even as my father's voice rose in anger, even as my mother sobbed in frustration, I didn't open it. I stood there, leaning against the wall, heart racing, hands shaking, but not from fear, from freedom. For the first time in my life, I had chosen myself, and it felt good. Update. The days that followed my parents' dramatic departure from my apartment were eerily silent, almost as if they had vanished into thin air. There were no follow-up texts, no desperate voicemails, no last-minute attempts to sway my decision. It was strange, this newfound quiet, almost unsettling in its absence of conflict. For the first time in my life, I wasn't on the receiving end of their guilt trips or thinly veiled disappointment, and yet, rather than feeling abandoned, I felt something entirely unexpected: relief. I told myself I should be focusing on healing, on regaining my strength after everything I had endured. My ribs still ached with every deep breath. My leg throbbed in protest whenever I pushed myself too hard, and even the smallest task seemed to take twice as much energy as it should have. But beyond the physical discomfort, there was a deeper wound, one that had been festering for years, buried beneath layers of forced smiles and quiet acceptance. And now that I had finally ripped off the bandage, exposing it to the cold light of day, I found myself wondering why I'd ever tolerated it for so long. I spent those days reacquainting myself with solitude, embracing the stillness in a way I never had before. It was strange how, after years of craving my parents' approval, after bending over backward to prove that I was worthy of their love, I suddenly found that I had no desire to mend what was irreparably broken. I had done my part, I had tried, and now I was done. But of course, it was never going to be that simple. The first sign that the peace wouldn't last came in the form of an article, a simple black and white headline that stared back at me from my phone screen one morning as I scrolled absently through the news. Major corporate fraud uncovered, senior employee implicated in multi-million-dollar scheme. My stomach dropped. I didn't even have to read the article to know exactly who they were talking about. My brother's name was plastered across the page, accompanied by a photo that was all too familiar. The polished, confident image that my parents had always paraded around, the same one they had used in every social announcement, every proud declaration of his success. Only this time there was no admiration in the accompanying text, no praise, no carefully curated narrative about his brilliance. This time there was only disgrace. I read the article in full, my pulse quickening with every damning detail. It wasn't just a minor oversight or a small-scale mistake, as my parents had initially implied. This was big, far bigger than I had imagined. The investigation had uncovered years' worth of fraudulent activity, an elaborate scheme involving falsified records, laundered funds, and offshore accounts. And my brother? He wasn't just a participant. He had been one of the central figures in the entire operation. It was all there in black and white, laid out for the world to see. He had been orchestrating the financial deception for more than a year, funneling corporate funds into personal investments, covering his tracks with forged documents and backdated transactions. And he hadn't done it alone. He had worked alongside several high-level executives, men who had used him as a key player in their corruption, allowing him to rise quickly through the ranks while he unknowingly painted a target on his own back. The evidence was overwhelming, the case airtight. There was no way out of this one. And my parents? They were drowning. Their carefully constructed image of the perfect family was crumbling before their eyes, their golden son reduced to nothing more than a criminal in the public eye. My father, once so revered in his business circles, had begun losing clients, his reputation tainted by association. My mother, once so eager to flaunt her son's success, had gone into hiding, avoiding friends, social events, even phone calls. And when everything collapsed, when their world started closing in around them, they did what they always did. They came to me. It started with a voicemail, one I almost didn't listen to, my finger hovering over the delete button before curiosity got the better of me. My mother's voice was shaky, thick with emotion. But it wasn't regret I heard, it was desperation. She pleaded with me, her words tumbling over themselves as she explained that they just needed a little help, just enough to get through this, just enough to bail him out and hire better lawyers. She didn't apologize for how they had treated me. She didn't acknowledge the way they had left me to rot in a hospital bed while they attended an award ceremony. She just wanted me to fix this for them, and she wasn't the only one. My father's message came next. His tone calm but urgent, laced with the same entitlement that had always been there beneath the surface. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He simply stated, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world, that family is supposed to stick together, that in times like these, we had to support one another. He said that he knew I had the means to help, that I had been doing well for myself, that it was only fair that I step up now. That was the moment I knew, with absolute certainty, that nothing had changed. They didn't see me as a daughter, as a person with her own life, her own struggles, her own pain. They saw me as a resource, a safety net, a backup plan for when their real child, the one who had always mattered, finally fell from grace. And I wasn't going to play that role anymore. I didn't respond. I let the messages pile up, watched as their calls became more frequent, their texts more frantic. And when the desperation shifted into anger, when my father's messages became sharper, filled with accusations of selfishness and cruelty, I simply blocked the number. It was that simple. I owed them nothing, not after years of being the family's second choice, not after they had abandoned me in my darkest hour, not after they had made it crystal clear that I was only valuable to them when they needed something. Let them sink. I had spent too long drowning to throw them a lifeline now, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. Second update. In the days that followed, as the weight of my decisions settled over me, like a long overdue reckoning, I found myself revisiting old memories, tracing the patterns of my childhood, sifting through the years of subtle dismissals and quiet neglect that had shaped me into someone who had spent far too long waiting for approval that was never going to come. It wasn't just about the accident, or the hospital, or even the betrayal of their absence in my time of need. It was about the realization that my entire life had been leading up to this moment, this inevitable breaking point where I could finally step away from the role they had assigned me and choose something different. But even as I tried to focus on moving forward, to leave the chaos of my family behind and embrace the quiet relief that came with severing those ties, my brother's name remained everywhere, woven into news reports, whispered about in business circles, dissected in legal discussions that I had no part in but somehow still felt tangled up in. The deeper I tried to pull away, the more his presence lingered, like a stain that refused to fade, a shadow that clung stubbornly to the edges of my newfound freedom. And then, just as I had begun to think that I could finally let it all go, that I could exist outside the weight of my family's dysfunction, an email arrived, one I hadn't been expecting, one that sent a slow ripple of unease crawling up my spine the moment I saw his name attached to it. It was from my brother. He had no access to a phone while incarcerated, no direct line of communication to the outside world except through carefully monitored channels. And yet, he had found a way to reach me. A friend of his, someone who still believed in his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, had sent it on his behalf, acting as the bridge between us, delivering the words he couldn't say himself. At first, I hovered over it, my finger poised over the delete button, my instincts screaming at me to let it go unread, to refuse to let him pull me back in, to reject whatever attempt he was making to sway me. But then, against my better judgment, against every promise I had made to myself about staying out of it, I clicked. His words were carefully chosen, deliberate in a way that was almost unsettling, as if he had rehearsed them over and over before committing them to text. He wasn't asking for money. That much was clear from the start. Instead, he was trying to rewrite the story, to reshape the narrative, to paint himself not as the mastermind of a fraudulent empire, but as a pawn, a victim caught in something far bigger than himself, a man who had made mistakes but had been used and discarded when it was convenient for others. He admitted to some of it, acknowledged that he had been involved, that he had participated, but insisted that the full truth was far more complicated than the report suggested. He claimed that he had never been the one in control, that he had trusted the wrong people, that the real orchestrators of the scheme were far more powerful, far more untouchable, and that they had used him as a shield, letting him take the fall while they remained safely hidden in the background. And for the first time, he said something I had never expected to hear from him. He admitted that our parents had always been toxic, that they had built him up into something unrealistic, untouchable, shaping him into the golden child while using me as the backdrop, the contrast that made him shine all the brighter. He said he understood now why I had always felt like an outsider in my own family, why I had resented the way they had prioritized him at every turn. He even admitted that, in some ways, he had resented it too, that he had spent his entire life trying to live up to the image they had created, terrified of what would happen if he ever failed to meet their expectations. And now he had failed in the most spectacular way possible. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to take his words at face value, to accept the idea that he had been manipulated, that he had been forced into this, that he had been nothing more than a cog in a machine far more powerful than himself. But deep down, beneath the surface of my lingering doubt, I knew that wasn't the full story. I had seen the way he had carried himself, the way he had reveled in his success, the way he had never once hesitated to use our parents' favoritism to his advantage. He might have been pressured, he might have been guided in the wrong direction, but he had still made his choices, still walked into it willingly, still profited off of it until it all came crashing down. But there was something in his words that gnawed at me, something that refused to let go. Because what if there was some truth to it? What if he really had been a scapegoat, just as much a victim as he was a perpetrator? What if I had misjudged the scale of it, assuming that he had been the one calling the shots when, in reality, he had been little more than a pawn in someone else's game? I wrestled with the questions for days, turning them over in my mind, unable to find a resolution that felt satisfying. And then, finally, after much hesitation, I reached out to someone I trusted, a lawyer friend, someone I had known for years, someone who had no connection to my family, no stake in the outcome. I explained everything in broad strokes, omitting the personal details, focusing only on the legal aspects, the possibilities, the implications. And what they told me only made things murkier. There was indeed evidence that others had been involved, that my brother wasn't the only one responsible, that there were larger forces at play, ones that had yet to be fully uncovered. But at the same time, that didn't absolve him of his role in it. He wasn't an innocent bystander caught in the crossfire. He had still committed the crimes, still made the decisions that had led him here, still benefited from the deception until it became too big to contain. I sat with that knowledge, let it settle into my bones, let it become part of the foundation of everything I now understood about my family, my past, my own place in the tangled mess of it all. And in the end, after weighing it from every angle, after considering every possible version of events, I came to a conclusion that surprised even me. I felt sorry for him. Not enough to help, not enough to forgive, but enough to recognize that he too had been shaped by the same parents, the same expectations, the same impossible standards. He had been the favored child, the celebrated one, the chosen son, but in the end, that hadn't saved him. It had only set him up for a bigger fall, and maybe in some twisted way, that was the real tragedy of it all. My parents, of course, refused to acknowledge any of this. They continued their campaign, their insistence that I was being selfish, that I was abandoning the family in its darkest hour, that I was turning my back on the people who had raised me. But I knew the truth now. I had seen it with my own eyes, had traced the patterns, had followed the threads all the way to their inevitable conclusion. And I wasn't going to let them drag me down with them. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. And I wasn't looking back. Finally, update. As the dust began to settle and the finality of everything started to take hold, I found myself experiencing an unexpected sense of clarity, as though the weight I had been carrying for so many years had suddenly been lifted, leaving behind an emptiness I wasn't quite sure how to fill. My entire life had been spent dancing on the edges of my family's expectations, constantly trying to balance between what they wanted me to be and who I actually was, always hoping, naively, foolishly, that one day things would shift, that I would matter as much as my brother, that I would be seen, truly seen, beyond the role they had assigned me. But now, with everything unraveling around them, with the truth exposed in ways that even they couldn't deny, I had finally let go of that hope. And instead of devastation, instead of the crushing grief I might have expected, I felt something far stranger. Freedom. It was in the silence that followed my refusal to help, in the unanswered messages, in the way my parents had stopped reaching out after I made it clear that I wasn't going to play the part they had written for me anymore. At first, I thought the quiet might suffocate me, that without the constant push and pull of their demands, I wouldn't know who I was outside of their neglect. But as the days passed, I realized that I wasn't lost at all. I was simply unburdened. The fallout from my brother's case was still ongoing, growing more complicated with each new revelation. As predicted, he had agreed to cooperate with authorities, offering up names, handing over evidence, hoping to trade information for a lesser sentence. And while it did buy him some leniency, the truth was unavoidable. He was still guilty. He had still committed the crimes, still participated knowingly, still benefited from the deception for as long as he could. No matter how many powerful people he exposed, no matter how much information he handed over, he would still have to pay for what he had done. And my parents? They had tried everything to maintain their grip on the life they had built, clinging desperately to the illusion that this could all be salvaged, that with enough money, enough influence, enough denial, they could somehow make this all disappear. But the world wasn't bending for them the way it used to. Their friends, the ones who had once been so eager to bask in the glow of my brother's success, had begun distancing themselves, quietly severing ties, unwilling to be caught in the storm of scandal. My father's business had taken a significant hit, his reputation no longer untouchable, and my mother had withdrawn completely, disappearing from social circles, refusing to acknowledge the whispers that followed her wherever she went. It was poetic in a way, watching the empire they had built around my brother slowly crumble, knowing that no matter how hard they tried to rebuild, it would never be the same. And yet, through it all, not once did they admit their mistakes. Not once did they acknowledge the way they had failed me, the way they had left me behind, the way they had only turned to me when they needed something. Not that I had expected them to. I'd stopped hoping for an apology long ago. But what I hadn't expected, what had caught me entirely off guard, was the way the rest of my extended family had reacted. When my parents had first tried to turn everyone against me, spinning their carefully crafted narrative about how I had abandoned my brother in his time of need, I had assumed the worst. I had prepared myself for isolation, for judgment, for the slow but inevitable unraveling of whatever fragile connections I had left within my family. But instead, something entirely unexpected happened. They reached out to me. First, it was a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, then an aunt, then another relative, each one cautiously testing the waters, trying to gauge what had really happened, their voices laced with something I hadn't anticipated, understanding. Because as it turned out, I wasn't the only one my parents had mistreated. I wasn't the only one they had used and discarded, the only one who had been pushed aside in favor of my brother's endless rise. One by one, they began sharing their own stories, quiet confessions that had been buried for years, moments where my parents had betrayed, manipulated, or abandoned them in pursuit of my brother's success. There were unpaid debts, broken promises, lies told to protect him, bridges burned to maintain his image, a long history of selfishness that had finally begun catching up to them. And for the first time, I realized that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. These were people I had once assumed had sided with my parents, people I had believed would never understand my pain. And yet, here they were, reaching out, offering their support, their validation, their quiet reassurances that I'd done the right thing by walking away. It was strange, after so many years of feeling like an outsider in my own family, to suddenly be the one they rallied around. But it was also healing in a way I hadn't known I needed. I found myself reconnecting with relatives I had barely known, forming bonds that had never been allowed to grow before, stepping into a version of family that wasn't built on competition and favoritism, but rather on mutual respect and understanding. It wasn't perfect. It would never replace what I had lost, but it was something, and that was more than I had ever expected. As for my parents, they remained silent. After their initial onslaught of messages, their last-ditch efforts to manipulate me into compliance, they had gone completely still, retreating into whatever remained of their broken world. I knew that, in their minds, I was the villain, the ungrateful daughter who had turned her back on her family, the one who had failed to fall in line when it mattered most. And for the first time, I didn't care, because I had finally learned something that had taken me 32 years to understand. Family isn't about obligation. It isn't about sacrificing yourself for people who only value you when they need something. It isn't about proving your worth to those who will never see it. Family is who shows up for you when you need them the most. And in the end, that hadn't been my parents. It hadn't been my brother. It had been the people who had seen my pain and acknowledged it. The ones who had witnessed my struggle and understood it. The ones who had stood by me, even when it wasn't easy. And that was enough. So as I stepped into this new chapter, into a life where I was no longer weighed down by the expectations of people who had never truly valued me, I found myself embracing the one thing I had never known I could have. Peace! And it was the most freeing thing I had ever felt. This story is titled, My Parents Chose My Brother's Award Over Visiting Me After a Car Crash. Now they want my savings to bail him out. I refused. I never thought much about fate. I used to believe that things just happened, that life unfolded without any grand design or cosmic irony. But lying there, staring at the hospital ceiling, feeling the sharp sting of pain in my ribs, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment I was finally forced to see my life for what it was. 2 weeks ago, I was just trying to get home after a long shift. The streets were quiet, the kind of eerie stillness that makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. 1 second, I was at a stoplight, waiting for it to turn green. The next, headlights came barreling toward me from the side, metal crunching, glass shattering, my car flipping like a rag doll tossed by an angry child. They told me later I was lucky to be alive. A few inches to the left and it would have been over. Instead, I ended up with 2 cracked ribs, a fractured leg, and internal bleeding that required emergency surgery. Lucky, that's what they called it. I wasn't sure if I agreed. What I did know was that I needed my parents. In that moment, lying in the hospital bed, my body aching in ways I never thought possible, all I wanted was to see them walk through that door. I wasn't expecting them to drop everything and stay by my side 24/7, but I thought at the very least they would come. They didn't. The first day passed, then the second. No calls, no messages. I kept telling myself they were busy, that maybe they were out of town or dealing with something urgent. But when the nurses told me they had reached out to my parents multiple times, only to be met with disinterest, it became harder to hold on to that illusion. Still, I tried. I sent texts every few hours, short messages just letting them know I was okay, that I was waiting for them. But the longer the silence stretched, the more the reality began to settle in. They weren't coming. I wasn't completely alone. My friends, the ones who lived in different states, pulled whatever strings they could to make sure I had support. A family friend who lived nearby even dropped in on the 6th day. She brought flowers, sat beside my bed, and tried to fill the silence with small talk. Then she casually mentioned it, the award ceremony. My brother's award ceremony. The words barely registered at first. She was smiling, telling me how wonderful it was that my brother had been recognized for his accomplishments. How proud my parents must have been standing there in the audience, watching him accept the honor. My chest tightened, not just from the pain of my injuries, but from something deeper, something colder. They had known. They had known I was lying in a hospital bed, recovering from surgery, and they still chose to celebrate my brother's achievement over checking if I was even alive. I wanted to believe there was some reasonable explanation, that maybe they had planned to come after the ceremony, but the truth settled into my bones like lead. This wasn't new. This had been happening my entire life. I wasn't the priority. I never had been. My brother had always been the golden child, the one they doted on, the one who could do no wrong. Every achievement he earned, every milestone he crossed, was celebrated like it was a victory for the entire family. Meanwhile, my own successes, whatever few I managed, were treated like footnotes, background noise, nothing worth remembering. I had spent years trying to ignore it, trying to pretend it didn't bother me. But sitting there, listening to someone else tell me how great my brother was while I had been left to rot in a hospital room, something inside me finally snapped. That night, I sent a message to my parents. It wasn't angry. It wasn't cruel. I simply told them that I couldn't believe they had chosen an award ceremony over their own daughter's well-being, that I was hurt, that I was disappointed. For the first time since the accident, they responded, and I wish they hadn't. Their reply wasn't an apology. It wasn't even concern. Instead, they defended their decision. They said my brother's award was a once-in-a-lifetime achievement, something they simply couldn't miss.